This is disc number 7.
Yet not everyone makes these fundamental adjustments, even when the need to change is stunningly obvious. Sometimes people become stuck, and as our next example demonstrates, the consequences of inertia can be substantial. Getting stuck in old rules. At the turn of the 20th century, Antarctica was the last great frontier of terrestrial exploration. The coast was barely charted, and it was just becoming clear that Antarctica was a continent, not a group of islands. Explorers were beginning to explore its impressive natural phenomena like its enormous ice shelf, lava lakes, and volcanoes. No one had yet penetrated very far into its interior, making the South Pole the ultimate prize for land explorers. In the Antarctic summer of 1911 to 1912, Robert Scott led England's Terra Nova expedition in a legendary race against Roald Amundsen's Norwegian team to be the first to the South Pole. To be first, Scott and Amundsen would have to travel over 1,500 miles across snow and ice in unforgiving weather. A betting person might have liked Scott's odds going into the race. He had more money than Amundsen and equipped his expedition with dogs, ponies, skis, and even cutting-edge motorized sleds. What's more, he had already traveled part of the route in an earlier expedition. Yet Scott lost both the race and his life. He and his men reached the pole, but several weeks after Amundsen's team got there, and then perished on their return journey. What accounted for this unexpected discrepancy between Amundsen, who made history, and Scott, who died tragically? On paper, both men looked like they had a good chance to win the race and would certainly survive it. Perhaps Amundsen's biggest advantage was his willingness to shift his mindset from his prior sea experiences to the land, learn about land travel at the poles, and craft new simple rules. Amundsen began his South Pole preparations by attempting to understand the simple rules that Fridtjof Nansen had used in his landmark crossing of Greenland. Use skis, a small team, and sleds pulled by dogs. From his observation of native Arctic people, Amundsen continued to learn about polar land travel in depth and gained the knowledge that he would later turn into how-to rules about nutrition, like eat fresh meat to avoid scurvy, and dog handling, such as have a lead skier whom the dogs can follow. As the trek to the South Pole unfolded, he added timing rules, including a consistent daily mileage that balanced progress with rest, and hourly stops to keep the dogs fresh. In contrast, Scott failed to create a relevant vision with new simple rules. Instead, he remained stuck in the wrong mindset, with rules that didn't work, and for reasons that are surprisingly universal. First, Scott could not escape the mindset of the Royal Navy. Scott was a career naval torpedo officer, trying to distinguish himself as a polar explorer at a time when there were few wars to fight. The Royal Navy operated with rules specifying top-down command, blind obedience to superiors, and strict separation of officers and men. So Scott was comfortable in the familiar hierarchy that supported literal obedience to orders and unquestioning respect based on rank. While these rules might have made sense on a ship, they were not helpful in Antarctic travel, where closely working together on small teams and sharing information in novel situations were vital. Scott was also trapped by the Royal Navy's ethos that there is nothing that English sailors cannot do. Consistent with this bravado, Scott tended to neglect careful preparation and preferred to wing it. Although Scott had an entire winter season to experiment with snow travel, he and his men were often busy with football games, scientific lectures, and work on their South Pole newspaper. Consistent with the Royal Navy and English society at large, Scott saw heroism as intimately tied with adversity and self-sacrifice. This view unfortunately led Scott to glorify man-hauling, whereby people, not animals like dogs, do the arduous work of pulling heavy sleds packed with food and gear over the snow. In a telling quote, Scott observed, In my mind, no journey ever made with dogs can approach the height of that fine conception which is realized when a party of men go forth to face the hardships, dangers, and difficulties with their own unaided efforts, and by days and weeks of hard physical labor, succeed in solving some of the problems of the great unknown. Although man-hauling was too slow, physically debilitating, and ultimately self-defeating, Scott, consistent with his time and place, perceived the extreme physical hardship of man-hauling as more valiant than relying on sled dogs, as Amundsen and other successful polar explorers had done. Second of all, Scott failed to make accurate attributions about the causes of his outcomes. Most of us tend to over-attribute our successes to ourselves rather than to the circumstances, and conversely, under-attribute our failures to ourselves. A key to getting unstuck from old rules is, however, to avoid this tendency to never take the blame. In the case of Scott, he had ample opportunity to use the outcomes of his earlier Antarctic expedition to adjust his simple rules for polar land travel. That expedition had produced scientific successes, like finding the Cape Crozier emperor penguin colony, but also plenty of failures, including equipment breakdowns, scurvy, and sled dog deaths, from which he could have learned. Yet after returning to England, Scott wrote a triumphant book in which he often attributed the expedition's successes to his own skilled leadership and the heroism of courageous Englishmen, and blamed failures on unfortunate fate and the perils of Antarctica. He treated malnutrition, for example, as an inevitable challenge of polar travel that he and his men overcame. He failed to mention the bungled food rationing that brought on the calamity, as described in the men's private diaries. Scott blamed the failure to progress farther south on an ill team member, one Ernest Shackleton, without examining his own lack of planning that contributed to Shackleton's contracting scurvy. He attributed the poor performance of the dogs to their unsuitability to polar travel while leaving out his failure to understand how to handle sled dogs. Research indicates that people learn best from their experience when they make accurate attributions, especially from failures. In Scott's case, it was difficult for him to learn new rules when he transformed failures into successes and misattributed the causes of relevant failures. Third, Scott isolated himself from information. Consistent with command in the Royal Navy, Scott was aloof. He took few people into his confidence and kept officers and men separated. People are more likely to develop correct attributions when they routinely discuss their experiences. And yet Scott's isolation impaired his ability to do this. He isolated himself in other ways, too. There is no report that he engaged in brainstorming activities or personal reflection. As one account notes, Scott's, naval training taught him form, routine, discipline, obedience, but stifled independent thought. He lacked the capacity to learn from experience. While Amundsen was interested in learning how native people lived in the Arctic, Scott dismissed them as uncivilized and not a source of useful information. Even if he had been motivated to add to or change his rules, his lack of insight would have limited their effectiveness. A pioneering journey to the South Pole demanded a new understanding with relevant simple rules. Amundsen studied up, shifted his mindset from sea to land travel, identified critical bottlenecks like dog handling and food provisioning, and filled in the rules. Scott, instead, stayed locked in the mindset of the British Navy, which was, at best, irrelevant to the expedition. Scott was undone by incorrect attributions that sapped his motivation to change and spotty information about where to change. These are universal reasons for why some people cannot rethink their situations and simple rules, even when the need to do so is blindingly obvious. Scott got it wrong. When people face a major disruption, such as a water shortage that might be permanent, or a new terrain to traverse, the key is to recognize that the change is happening and to study its implications well beyond surface understanding. then break the old rules and move on to the new ones quickly. There are situations, however, when it is unwise to wait passively for the next big change. In these situations, it makes sense to be the disruption, proactively shifting the bottlenecks to success and breaking the rules for everyone else. Changing the bottlenecks, rewriting the rules. Once upon a time, an amiable show called Cheers ruled television. When Cheers, set in a Boston bar, where everybody knows your name, debuted in September 1982, the critics loved it, but ordinary viewers were not so enamored. The show sank to the bottom of TV ratings. An undeterred NBC stuck with it, and the network's faith paid dividends. Cheers became a mainstay of NBC's blockbuster Thursday night programming, along with The Cosby Show and Family Ties. Cheers stayed on primetime television for 11 seasons, and 40 million viewers watched its final episode. Writing is a crucial bottleneck to quality television and was essential for Cheers' success. Witty repartee among the show's memorable characters kept viewers tuning in. Bar owner Sam Malone was an unapologetic Lothario who constantly was wooing not-so-bright women. Sam's foil was a waitress named Diane Chambers, an intellectual snob stranded at the bar by a flyaway fiancé. Sam and Diane's unlikely chemistry provided one of the comedy's prime romantic tensions and left the audience wondering week after week, will they or won't they become a couple? The colorful ensemble cast members, including Carla, the sharp-tongued waitress, Norm, the stout everyman, and Cliff, the garrulous postal worker, changed remarkably little over the show's lengthy run. Cheers writers used several simple how-to rules for writing. One was to develop characters with very distinct personality traits. The idea was to give the audience a sense of predictability and familiarity with each character. The writers often created particular situations and then explored how each character would respond. In later seasons, the writers purposefully surprised the audience by occasionally having the characters behave in the opposite way to what was expected. This rule let the writers develop characters' richness without diminishing their distinctiveness. A more challenging rule further distinguished each character. Each character had a unique way of speaking, and this rule was termed "right for radio," meaning that the audience could know who was talking just by hearing the dialogue. Another rule was that every episode had to stand alone such that viewers could watch any episode at any time in any sequence, and its storyline would stand alone. This meant that writers had to create a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end for each episode. When Cheers writers converged in the writers' room to share their own experiences, they wanted episode themes that aroused universal emotions like being embarrassed, amused, or scared. The rule was that anything with friction that resonates for lots of people was fair game for an episode. The writers were pragmatic and fast, and they often zoomed through creating rough drafts so they could take time detailing polished drafts. Within the rules, however, Cheers writers had extensive flexibility to explore all sorts of issues, including controversial ones. Despite being a light comedy, Cheers was among the first TV shows to address feminism, homosexuality, and addiction. When the bar closed in May 1993, Cheers was one of the longest-running network series ever. The simple rules helped the writers to create the vivid characters, smart dialogue, and creative storylines that made the show such a hit. During its long run, Cheers was nominated for 117 Emmys, winning 26. In 2013, TV Guide named Cheers the 11th greatest show of all time, beating competition like Star Trek, Saturday Night Live, and Mad Men. Cheers is a remarkably successful example of a show where viewers could tune in at almost any time and feel at home, even if they had missed a few episodes. Its simple rules for writing were geared around this promise. The stable cast of sympathetic and predictable characters did not change from episode to episode. Each episode had a self-contained story, and shows were written with a brisk rhythm because episodes did not need to fit into a complex storyline. This instant familiarity was critical in a time before DVR, when viewers could not catch up on episodes they missed. Episodic simple rules are not limited to sitcoms like Cheers, or the vast number of comedies it has influenced, like Friends and How I Met Your Mother. They span television genres, notably procedural dramas in which familiar characters do the same thing in every episode, like solving a case in CSI or diagnosing an illness in House. In March 2011, Netflix executives were surveying the new television landscape they had helped create. TV in the 2010s looked radically different from the heyday of Cheers, and Netflix was at the forefront of redefining television. With the sizable capital it had accumulated after destroying Blockbuster, Netflix was about to dive into original programming, offering television without a channel. It was a historic step and a big risk. Netflix needed a hit to stand out from the crowd. The question was, how to create one? Writing was an obvious place to start. After the advent of DVR and non-network channels like HBO, television entered what TV critic Brent Martin calls its third golden age. The Sopranos ushered in this era with serialized, not episodic shows. While viewers could watch any episode of Cheers and know roughly what was going on, if they walked into a mid-season episode of The Sopranos, they would be constantly asking, "What's happening? Who is that guy?" Shows like The Sopranos darkened the tone with edgy storylines and took more risks than network shows with their mass-market audiences. After The Sopranos, The Wire, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, and similar hits, audiences were primed for serialized shows that explored serious themes. Like Cheers, these shows relied on excellent writing, but to be successful, they had to redefine the rules. Netflix, of course, could have followed the Cheers-style simple rules that were still driving some of the most popular entertainment on television. Procedural dramas like NCIS and sitcoms like 2.5 Men and The Big Bang Theory, which follow the simple rules of episodic writing so faithfully that critics accuse them of being formulaic, dominated television. But Netflix executives realized that employing the same old rules would not be enough to break out of the pack. Revolutionary times call for revolutionary measures. In order to change how television worked and skyrocket a non-channel show to stardom, Netflix would have to change the game. It would have to join the revolution of the third golden age of television and then push that revolution one step further. In February 2013, Netflix's long shot debuted. House of Cards stars two-time Oscar winner Kevin Spacey as Francis Frank Underwood, a conniving politician from rural South Carolina. In the series premiere, Frank is passed over for Secretary of State and embarks on a path of power and revenge. To tell Frank's story, House of Cards writers embraced the serialized format. They used event foreshadowing and wove characters in and out of the story. A character could appear in episode 2 and then disappear until episode 8, something that Sam's character in Cheers would never do. Instead of stable character development, as expressed through the character's predictable reactions to common situations, House of Cards characters develop in lengthy side segments, like when a vice-prone congressman is portrayed hanging out with his kids. While excellent writing is part of the House of Cards story, the bigger story is Netflix and its re-envisioning of television. In earlier chapters, we defined bottlenecks as decisions or activities that hinder value creation. In essence, Netflix attacked critical bottlenecks that others had accepted as the status quo. For example, rather than focus primarily on writing as the key bottleneck, Netflix and its partner, Media Rights Capital, made the strategic bet that world-class directing could help House of Cards stand out among the vast array of choices available to viewers. To stand out, House of Cards did something very rare in television. The show recruited an A-list Hollywood director. That director was David Fincher, a two-time Oscar nominee who had directed top films like The Social Network, The Curious Life of Benjamin Button, and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. As the story goes, Fincher was on the prowl for new projects when a remake of the British political thriller House of Cards crossed his path. Media Rights Capital owned the rights to the show and wanted Fincher at the helm of a U.S. remake. Fincher loved the BBC version, stating, "The way it was structured was so smart. Meeting him, the lead character played by Ian Richardson, at his lowest point and watching him gain traction as he begins to move all the pieces on the chessboard." Netflix and its partners gave Fincher the directorial control that is common in movie making. With a 26-episode commitment from Netflix, Fincher had the freedom to establish a creative process that was freeing for directors. He signed up 5 leading directors, including Charles McDougall, Desperate Housewives, The Office, and Alan Coulter, The Sopranos, to direct their own episodes. Fincher directed the first 2 episodes to set the tone, and then left the director's chair. The rules called for each director to be responsible for 2 sequential episodes and a 20-day shoot. The directors were also required to watch Fincher's first 2 episodes to get a feel for the show and read the scripts leading up to their own episodes. Fincher strongly suggested that the directors use the more cinematic stationary camera, a classic movie-making technique that emphasizes framing shots with intriguing angles, lighting, and actor movement. After that, Fincher left the directors alone. They could take their episodes wherever they liked within the story arc, had the flexibility to cast their own day players for characters introduced in their episodes, and could do their final cuts. The result is the signature and Emmy-winning cinematic quality of House of Cards. Beyond directing, Netflix tackled another novel and neglected bottleneck: programming. Picking winning TV shows is a major bottleneck to the success of media companies because viewers will simply avoid shows that don't interest them. Yet, since the dawn of television, picking winners has been more art than science, and has rested on guesswork and luck. That is why media companies rely on well-worn rules for programming that commit them to shows in stages: first a pilot, then a few shows, and then a single season. Netflix broke those rules and did so with technology that didn't exist in the days of Cheers. It committed to 2 full seasons in advance, no pilot, no stages. Why? As one pundit claims, Netflix knew you would like House of Cards before you did. While this downplays the very real risk Netflix was taking in launching a major new show, there is more than a sliver of truth in it. With about 30 million subscribers, Netflix understood what its members were watching, and with a granularity that executives in other media companies could only envy. Its analytics, for instance, picked up on the success of the British version of House of Cards and the popularity of David Fincher and Kevin Spacey movies on Netflix. The new programming rule to buy shows sight unseen was innovative and let Netflix obtain House of Cards before other buyers were ready to commit. It's an intriguing rule as well because it exploits Netflix's unique big data capabilities, making it a less risky rule than it would be for a conventional television network. By exploiting its unique capabilities, Netflix proactively redefined the boundary rules for choosing television programming. Netflix broke the rules of programming again by releasing the entire season at once, an innovative rule that the company used again with shows like Orange is the New Black. The rules seemed risky at the time. After all, viewers traditionally watched new shows with breaks in between episodes, which built anticipation and excitement into the viewing experience. Releasing an entire series all at once might temper the romance. But again, this practice exploited the unique expertise of Netflix. The company had data on millions of searches, pauses, rewinds, and fast-forwards, and knew how frequently people already streamed multiple shows in one sitting. In other words, Netflix knew from its vast data that many viewers were already binge-watching shows. As important, the all-at-once rule made House of Cards stand out in the media and break away from the pack, just as Netflix wanted. As if breaking the rules of 2 bottlenecks were not enough disruption of the industry, Netflix tackled a third novel bottleneck: hiring. The creators of successful shows like Cheers, of course, pay attention to talent, and hiring appropriate people is critical to success. Yet Netflix changed the rules of talent acquisition, signing Fincher, one of the only A-list directors to ever take on a television show, and Spacey, one of the biggest A-list actors to ever star in a television show. Even the relatively novice creator Beau Willimon had an Oscar nomination for screenwriting a George Clooney movie, The Ides of March. The rule of hiring such high-quality talent seemed risky from the outside. Netflix has, however, long focused on the hiring bottleneck in its existing businesses and was simply exploiting familiar boundary and how-to rules: hire the very best, pay them top dollar, and leave them alone. Netflix applied those rules to House of Cards, and its starred talent generated extensive media attention, just as Netflix executives had hoped. Individually, many of the House of Cards rules had some precedents. The serialization writing rules were similar to those of other shows with intricate and edgy plots. Although star directors are rare, House of Cards followed ABC's Twin Peaks, directed by David Lynch in the early 1990s. Yet taken collectively, the House of Cards rules, including its unique programming and talent rules, produced something unusual in television history. House of Cards was a stunning success that became the first Emmy-winning show never seen on traditional television, getting 12 nods and winning 3. It also picked up 4 Golden Globe nominations, including a win for Robin Wright. The show moved the needles that Netflix wanted to shift, achieving a leading position on the map for top-notch creative content and a heftier subscriber base. Sometimes it is enough to adapt to a dramatic change, like re-envisioning a garden in the face of a water shortage. Other situations demand proactive change, just as the Oakland A's initially changed their vision of baseball with the Moneyball rules, and then changed their vision and rules again when Moneyball faltered. House of Cards proactively tried to alter the landscape of television. Cheers perfected the simple rules for episodic television writing that are still in use today. In contrast, Netflix broke away from the industry with a disruptive focus on neglected bottlenecks: directing, programming, and talent acquisition. The company's adaptiveness and willingness to change the bottlenecks gave it the freedom to rewrite its rules. Conclusion. When Janet Yellen was sworn in as the 15th chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in February 2014, she took on one of the toughest jobs in the world. The Federal Reserve Board is charged with keeping the U.S. economy on track. This is a demanding job in the best of conditions, but Yellen took charge as the economy was clawing its way out of the deepest downturn since the Great Depression. The board's decisions on whether to raise or cut interest rates may seem far removed from the day-to-day lives of most Americans, but they have profound consequences. In addition to keeping inflation under control, the Federal Reserve Board is charged with maximizing employment, a critical issue when more than 10 million Americans were out of work. As chair, Yellen understood the human costs of joblessness. Long-term unemployment is devastating to workers and their families, she noted in a 2013 speech. The toll is simply terrible on the mental and physical health of workers, on their marriages, and on their children. If ever there was a system too complex for simple rules, it would be the U.S. economy, which consists of hundreds of government agencies, thousands of banks, tens of millions of companies, and over 100 million households interacting with one another every day. And yet, within 3 months of taking office, Yellen outlined a framework for making decisions on interest rates, which Bloomberg.com dubbed her Mind the Gap rule. This timing rule, in essence, states that the Federal Reserve Board will not increase interest rates until the economy achieves target levels of employment and inflation. Yellen's Mind the Gap rule is a variant of an earlier guideline developed in 1992 by Stanford economist John Taylor as a practical tool to guide monetary policy. Within a few years, Taylor's rule was being used along with other rules of thumb, as a benchmark to guide and evaluate policy decisions not only by the Federal Reserve, but also by central bankers around the world. Simple rules to manage economic complexity are far from new. In 15th century Europe, there were over 500 mints supplying nearly 100 currencies. Medieval princes routinely reduced the silver or gold content of their coins and passed the diluted currency on to their subjects, thereby fueling price inflation. Under pressure from merchants who refused to accept debased currency, some princes transferred their right of coinage to autonomous city councils, a forerunner of the modern central bank, some of which relied on simple rules to regulate currency. The rules used to manage monetary policy grew more sophisticated over time. As England's master of the mint in 1717, Sir Isaac Newton decreed the Golden Rule that paper currency must be convertible to an equivalent amount of gold. 8 decades later, England abandoned Newton's Golden Rule and proceeded to print pounds to fund the Napoleonic Wars. The financial chaos that followed inspired English bankers to develop new rules to stabilize England's economy. 1. Limit the amount of paper money. 2. Never reduce circulating cash, but vibrate within limits. 3. Expand cash as trade expands. And 4. Allow temporary increases in emergencies. Overcoming the barriers to simplicity. The simple rules used by central bankers bring us full circle to where we began this book. Like battlefield medics, central bankers use simple rules to make critical decisions in the face of daunting complexity. The use of simple rules when the stakes are so high, millions of jobs, for example, or the difference between life and death, illustrates their power in even the most complex situations. These rules also raise an important question. If simple rules are so effective in so many situations, why do complex solutions remain so prevalent? Regulators churn out ever more detailed rules, personnel departments promulgate thick policy manuals, and self-styled experts promote ever more arcane diet and exercise regimes. People crave simplicity, and, as we've argued throughout this book, simple rules often outperform more complicated approaches. Why aren't simple rules even more common? What are the obstacles to simplifying our lives, corporations, and societies? And, most important, how can we overcome these obstacles to achieve simplicity? The first obstacle is the effort required to develop simple rules. Like most worthwhile endeavors, it takes time and energy to get them right. The process of developing simple rules requires ruthless prioritization, honing in on the essential and decluttering the peripheral. You must identify which of many objectives will move the needles. Identify the specific activity or decision that represents a critical bottleneck, and prune dozens of potential rules down to a handful. Each step requires you to make difficult trade-offs and ask hard questions. But when you consider the costs of developing simple rules, don't ignore the costs of not using them. The enervation of complicated solutions, for example, or the frustration of failing to achieve your objectives year after year. When explaining how he led Apple's resurgence from near bankruptcy, Steve Jobs emphasized the power of simplicity. "You have to work hard to get your thinking clear to make it simple," Jobs said. "But it is worth it in the end because once you get there, you can move mountains." The payoffs of simplification often dwarf the costs of getting there. The people who benefit from complexity pose a second obstacle to simplicity. The costs of complex solutions are distributed across many people, while the benefits of complexity tend to be concentrated in the hands of a few. These beneficiaries have, as a consequence, strong incentives to resist simplification. Much of the complexity of the U.S. tax code, for example, exists because special interest groups secure tax breaks, including write-offs for owning a racehorse or building a racetrack, that benefit a small number of individuals. These special interest groups obviously benefit from complexity, but so do the lobbyists who make their case to legislators, as well as the lawmakers themselves. After creating a labyrinth of rules, Regulators and politicians often walk through the revolving door to join the companies they formerly supervised. In the private sector, they can guide their new employers through the maze of regulations they themselves helped build. And the revolving door between government and business is likely to spin faster as regulatory complexity increases. A recent study found that the number of former regulators hired by financial service firms increased by 55% between 2001 and 2013. The third obstacle to simplicity is what we call the myth of requisite complexity, the mistaken belief that complex problems demand complicated solutions. There are, naturally, situations when complicated solutions are appropriate. Recall the detailed checklists used by pilots and surgeons. But detailed rules and regulations aren't the only possible way to deal with complexity. The U.S. Congress responded to the 2008 financial crisis by drafting tens of thousands of pages of detailed regulations covering financial service organizations. That may be the best approach to avert future crises, but it is certainly not the only option. Andy Haldane is the chief economist at the Bank of England and was named one of the world's most influential people by Time magazine. At a recent conference of central bankers from around the world, Haldane argued that simple rules could prevent future banking crises more effectively than voluminous regulation. Haldane may be right, and he may be wrong, but surely this is a debate worth having. Complicated solutions should be a considered choice, not the result of regulatory autopilot. Whether simple rules or detailed regulations are more effective is ultimately an empirical question that should be resolved by testing them to see which works better in the real world. Such studies are rare, and the few done to date underscore the danger of assuming that more rules are always better. Consider the results of a recent study that analyzed legal systems around the world. The authors compared how well the judicial systems in 109 countries resolve two of the most common legal disputes: evicting a tenant who stops paying rent and chasing down payment on a bounced check. Their study revealed enormous variation across countries in terms of the number of rules limiting a judge's discretion, with more rule-laden systems taking an order of magnitude longer to mete out justice. In the United States, a landlord could evict a delinquent tenant in under 2 months, a process that took 18 months in Austria. The authors measured justice along several dimensions, including whether citizens considered their legal systems impartial, free from corruption, affordable, and consistent. The number of rules was negatively correlated with all measures of justice. Any way the authors cut the data, the result was the same: more rules, less justice. Often, complex rules and regulations arise out of a distrust of human nature. If people cannot be trusted to do the right thing, detailed regulations are necessary to prevent malfeasance. Many corporations, for example, rely on thick policy manuals to control people who might abuse their discretion. But these bad apples represent a tiny fraction of all employees. After studying their human resources policies, executives at Netflix determined that 97% of their employees were trustworthy. Nearly all of the company's time writing, monitoring, and enforcing detailed personnel policies was directed at the remaining 3%. Rather than continue to produce binders of detailed regulations, Netflix executives concentrated on not hiring people who would cause problems and removing them quickly when hiring mistakes were made. This change allowed the company to replace thick manuals with simple rules. The company's policy for expenses, travel, gifts, and conducting personal business at work, for example, was reduced to 4 rules. 1. Expense what you would not otherwise spend. 2. Travel as if it were your own money. 3. Disclose non-trivial gifts from vendors. And 4. Do personal stuff at work when it is inefficient not to. Rules to liberate. We typically equate rules with restrictions that limit our options and keep us from doing what we want to do. But rules enable as well as constrain. By following simple rules, parents and investors can resist short-term temptations and achieve their long-term objectives. Using simple rules, entrepreneurs and managers can seize opportunities to grow their business without losing sight of their overall strategy. Rules can help us make better decisions, on the fly, when information is limited. Artists like Elmore Leonard and Claude Monet unleashed their creativity by following a handful of rules. As members of organizations, communities, and societies, we can coordinate our activities even as we pursue our personal objectives. Following the rule to drive on the right-hand side of the road, everyone can arrive at their destination while minimizing the odds of an accident. As we have seen throughout this book, simple rules work because they provide a threshold level of structure while leaving ample scope to exercise discretion. Complex rules, in contrast, attempt to anticipate every contingency and dictate what to do in each scenario, thereby reducing people to automatons who do what they are told. But human discretion is not a defect to be eliminated. It is our greatest hope in the battle against complexity. Close to the facts on the ground, individuals can draw on their judgment and creativity to manage risks and seize unexpected opportunities. The latitude to exercise discretion not only makes simple rules effective, it makes them attractive. People thrive when given the opportunity to apply their judgment and creativity to the situations they face from day to day. And if they benefit from simple rules, they are more likely to use them and use them well. In many areas of our lives, both professional and personal, we face an apparently unpalatable choice between the simplicity we crave and complicated solutions that seem necessary. This trade-off is often false. For many of our most important activities and decisions, simple rules are both more desirable and more effective than complicated solutions. We wrote this book to open readers' eyes to the myriad possibilities they have to tackle complexity with simplicity, and to provide concrete guidance on how to seize these opportunities. For those who wield the power of simple rules, complexity is not destiny. We hope you have enjoyed our presentation of Simple Rules: How to Thrive in a Complex World by Donald Sull and Kathleen M. Eisenhart. Performed by Jeff Cummings. Directed by Joe Sturgill. Performance copyright 2015 by Brilliance Audio. All rights reserved. For further information concerning this program or other Brilliance Audio titles, please call the following toll-free number: 1-800-222-3225, or visit our website at www.brillianceaudio.com. No part of this recording may be played for an audience or reproduced in any form. It may not be streamed, downloaded, broadcast, or copied without written permission. Address all inquiries to Brilliance Audio, P.O. Box 887, Grand Haven, Michigan, 49417.